Dr. Benjamin Marshall's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, his morning coffee growing cold as he stared at the impossible sight ahead. A German shepherd stood motionless on Interstate 24's shoulder, silver duct tape wrapped 3 times around his head like a blindfold, cars screaming past at 70 miles per hour just inches from his bleeding paws. The dog wasn't moving toward safety. He was guarding a battered brown suitcase. A handwritten note fluttered against the leather handle. "Free dog. Too loud. Reminds me of her." Ben's breath caught in his throat. In 30 years of pediatric surgery, he'd seen cruelty, but this calculated abandonment of a creature so deliberately helpless made his chest tighten with familiar rage. The shepherd's ribs pressed through matted fur like prison bars, yet he stood perfectly still, protecting whatever secrets lay inside that weathered case. Ben pulled over, his hands shaking, not from his heart condition this time, but from recognition. Something about those amber eyes, visible through gaps in the tape, stirred a memory he'd buried 3 years ago. What had someone thrown away? And why did this broken dog feel like his last chance at redemption? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The autumn morning air carried the scent of pine and regret as Ben Marshall approached the trembling German shepherd. At 72, his knees protested every step, but something deeper than arthritis made him move carefully. This dog had the stillness of a creature who'd learned that movement brought consequences. "Easy there, soldier," Ben whispered, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had once calmed frightened children in hospital corridors. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't retreat, didn't growl, just stood there like the world's most broken sentry guarding treasures only he understood. Ben had been driving to nowhere in particular, a ritual that filled the empty hours since Margaret's funeral 2 years ago. Their 3-bedroom house in Gainesville had become a museum of memories he couldn't bear to disturb. Her reading glasses still folded on the nightstand, her coffee mug waiting in the sink. At his age, routine was religion, and loneliness was the congregation he'd never wanted to join. The duct tape came away in strips, taking patches of fur with it. 3 layers, wrapped with deliberate cruelty to ensure helplessness without death. When the last piece fell away, amber eyes blinked against the harsh Florida sun, then immediately dropped to the asphalt. The gaze of something that had forgotten it deserved to look at the world directly. "There we go," Ben said, his voice catching on words that felt rusty from disuse. These days he talked mostly to Margaret's photograph and the checkout clerks at Publix who'd grown tired of his weekly stories about weather and medications. The suitcase was brown leather, cracked with age and held together by more duct tape than faith. Whatever secrets it contained, this dog wasn't leaving them. His legs trembled, dehydration, exhaustion, heat. But he didn't sit, didn't seek shade. Just stood there like a monument to loyalty that the world had forgotten how to recognize. Ben understood that kind of standing. He'd been doing it himself for 3 years, ever since Grace Walker died on his operating table, and Richard Walker's lawsuit had stripped away everything: his medical license, his reputation, his reason for getting up each morning. Some days, the only thing keeping him upright was Margaret's voice echoing in empty rooms. "The Lord doesn't give us more than we can handle, Benjamin." Margaret had always overestimated the Lord's judgment. The dog accepted water from Ben's cupped palms, but wouldn't step away from the suitcase. When Ben finally picked up the weathered handle, the shepherd moved for the first time. Not fast, he couldn't manage fast, but deliberate steps following not the man, but the case itself. Whatever was inside had become this creature's entire world. In 30 minutes, Ben would discover it would become his salvation too, though redemption often comes disguised as someone else's broken heart needing repair. The animal shelter was only 10 minutes away, but some journeys change everything about the distance between who you were and who you're meant to become. The Gainesville Animal Shelter smelled of disinfectant and hope deferred, a combination Ben knew well from his years walking hospital corridors. Jessica Martinez, the intake coordinator, had known him since he'd started volunteering after Margaret got sick, back when helping abandoned animals felt like practice for saving something, anything, when he couldn't save the person who mattered most. Found him on State Road 24, Ben explained, settling into the plastic chair that had supported too many desperate conversations. Someone taped his eyes shut and left him with this. He lifted the suitcase, surprised by its weight. Not heavy, but substantial, like it carried more than belongings. Thunder. Ben had started thinking of him by that name from the moment those amber eyes had looked at him with such ancient sadness, hadn't moved from his position beside the case. Even in the relative safety of the examination room, he maintained that soldier's stillness, ears constantly rotating to track sounds that might signal danger. Dr. Sarah Chen, the shelter's veterinarian, worked with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd learned to read trauma in the set of shoulders, the flinch response, the way breathing became a conscious act. "Microchipped," she announced, scanning between Thunder's shoulder blades. "Registered to Richard Walker, Gainesville address." "But Ben," she paused, meeting his eyes. "The address was foreclosed 6 months ago." The name hit Ben like cold water. Richard Walker, Grace's father. The man who'd stood in a courtroom 3 years ago and called Ben a butcher, a killer, a surgeon whose arrogance had murdered a 6-year-old girl. The man whose lawsuit had cost Ben everything except the breath in his lungs and the guilt in his chest. "I know that name," Ben said quietly, his hands trembling as he reached for the suitcase zipper. Thunder's eyes tracked every movement, muscles coiled like springs, but he didn't growl or snap, just watched with the intensity of someone guarding state secrets. Inside, Ben's world tilted. A child's drawings, done in careful crayon strokes on construction paper, stick figures of a girl and a dog labeled "Me and Thunder" in block letters. "Thunder is the best dog. Thunder protects me." One drawing showed the dog standing between the stick figure girl and a scribbled black mass labeled "Monster." There were voice recordings on a small digital device, wrapped carefully in plastic. A pink hair clip with a butterfly, the kind a little girl might wear to feel pretty on days when chemo made everything else ugly. Dog toys worn to threads by love and constant companionship. And tucked in the side pocket, a collar, leather with brass fittings, the kind you'd buy for a dog you planned to love forever. "Jesus Christ," Ben whispered, then immediately apologized to the air. Margaret never liked him taking the Lord's name in vain, but some discoveries demanded stronger language than prayer could provide. Dr. Chen was making calls, trying to reach Richard Walker, but Ben barely heard her voice. He was staring at the drawings, seeing not just a child's art, but a testament to devotion. Grace had loved this dog with the pure intensity only children could manage, before the world taught them that love was dangerous, that everything you cherished could be taken away. That's when the Cooper family arrived. Michael Cooper moved like a man carrying invisible weight, the posture of someone working 80-hour weeks to pay medical bills that never seemed to shrink. Patricia Cooper held herself with the careful composure of mothers who'd learned not to hope too hard, too fast. Between them, holding each parent's hand like an anchor, was 7-year-old Hannah. "We're looking for a therapy dog," Patricia explained to Jessica, her voice carrying that particular exhaustion of parents who'd tried everything. "For Hannah. She hasn't spoken since—" The sentence hung unfinished in the fluorescent air. Some stories didn't need endings. They toured the main adoption area first, dogs that barked and wagged and performed their desperate auditions for love. Hannah walked through like a tourist in a museum, observing but not engaging, her silence so complete it seemed to have weight. Then she saw thunder. Ben watched it happen through the observation window. Hannah stopped mid-step, her mother's hand slipping from her grip. Her head tilted, studying thunder through the chain-link barrier with the intensity of someone recognizing their own reflection in unexpected places. Thunder, who hadn't lifted his head for anyone, slowly turned to look at her. They stared at each other, two damaged souls conducting a conversation in the language of shared understanding. No barking, no tail wagging, just acknowledgement that carried more weight than words. Hannah took one step forward, then another. Patricia reached for her daughter, but Jessica held up a warning hand. They all held their breath as this slip of a child approached the gate where thunder waited, still as stone but somehow different, alert in a way that spoke of recognition, of purpose remembered. The suitcase sat between them like a bridge between past and future, carrying secrets that would soon change everything. Hannah slipped through the kennel gate before anyone could stop her, moving with the fluid certainty of water finding its level. Patricia gasped. Michael stepped forward, but Ben found himself saying, "Wait." The child didn't reach for thunder, didn't try to pet him or coo the baby talk most people used with dogs. Instead, she sat down 3 feet away, cross-legged on the concrete floor, and pulled out a small notebook. She began to draw, her pencil moving in careful strokes while Thunder watched with an intensity that made Ben's chest tight. Minutes passed. Hannah drew. Thunder watched. The rest of them might as well have been furniture for all the attention the pair paid to the adult world, hovering anxiously nearby. Then, without warning, Thunder stood. His legs shook with the effort, but he stood. He took one step toward Hannah, stopped as if asking permission with each movement. Another step. Another pause. When he finally reached her, he did something that made Patricia cover her mouth with trembling fingers. He laid his great head on Hannah's knee, gentle as a butterfly landing, and closed his eyes. This dog, who wouldn't let trained professionals touch him, who'd been wrapped in duct tape and abandoned, who trusted nothing but a worn suitcase, he gave his trust to a 7-year-old who couldn't speak. Hannah's hand hovered over his scarred head, trembling like a leaf in wind. Then, soft as breath, she touched his ear, the good one first, then the damaged one that hung wrong from old injury. Thunder sighed, a sound so human it made Ben's throat close up. "My God," Michael whispered, but that wasn't the miracle. The miracle came when Hannah opened her mouth and a sound emerged. Not a word, just a hum. 3 wavering notes that hung in the air like hope, made audible. It was the first sound she'd made in 8 months, and Thunder's tail, that poor, lifeless tail, swayed once in response. "We'll take him," Patricia said immediately, her voice thick with tears and desperate hope. "Whatever it costs, whatever he needs." "He's not ready," Ben interrupted, surprising himself. The words came from somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere that recognized damaged things and the time they needed to heal. "Look at him. 3,000 in medical bills, trauma that goes bone deep. And there's this." He indicated the suitcase. "He won't leave it. There's someone, he's still waiting for." Michael Cooper studied his daughter, who'd gone back to drawing, Thunder's head still resting on her knee. "Then we'll wait with him," he said quietly. "Hannah's been waiting too. Maybe they can wait together." That's when the phone rang. Jessica stepped away to answer, her face going pale as she listened. "Mr. Walker?" "Yes, we have a German Shepherd matching that description." Ben's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "Tomorrow at 10. Yes? Bring documentation of ownership." She hung up and met Ben's eyes with the look of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The owner's coming. Richard Walker. Says his dog was stolen from his property. The word stolen hit the room like a physical blow. Ben stood too fast, his bad hip screaming in protest. Stolen? He duct-taped his eyes shut and left him to die on a highway. We don't know that for certain, Jessica said carefully, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much cruelty wrapped in legal technicalities. If he has proof of ownership. Ben looked at Thunder, still leaning into Hannah's touch, at the suitcase he guarded like a shrine, at the drawings scattered on the floor that told a story of love and protection. That USB drive in the suitcase, has anyone looked at it? Evidence, Jessica said. We can't just— The hell we can't! Ben was already moving, arthritis and dignity be damned. That little girl in those drawings, she's the key. And I'll bet my pension she's not waiting for Walker at home. Patricia stood, decision crystallizing on her face like ice forming on glass. We have a laptop in the car. Whatever's on that drive, we need to see it before tomorrow. Michael nodded grimly. If someone hurt this dog, if they hurt a child, we need to know. Ben looked back at Hannah and Thunder. She'd stopped drawing and was sitting with both hands resting on his scarred head, humming that three-note melody that seemed to unlock something in the dog's broken spirit. Two wounded creatures holding each other up in a world that had failed them both. 72 hours, Jessica said quietly. That's the legal hold before ownership claims can be processed. Whatever we're going to do, we have that long. 72 hours to solve a mystery written in scars and silence. 72 hours to save a dog who'd already saved a little girl just by existing. 72 hours to prove that sometimes family isn't about papers and microchips. It's about who shows up when you can't see through the tape wrapped around your eyes. Ben picked up the USB drive, feeling its weight, heavier than plastic should be, dense with secrets that could change everything. Tomorrow, Richard Walker would walk through those doors with legal documents and ownership papers, ready to reclaim the dog he'd abandoned. Walker, who'd already destroyed Ben's life once, who'd stood in a courtroom and called him a killer while Grace's tiny body lay cold in the morgue. But tonight they had time. Tonight they had a chance to uncover whatever truth Grace had hidden in that suitcase. Whatever final gift a dying 6-year-old had left for the dog who'd loved her unconditionally. Let's go, Ben said, his voice steadier than it had been in years. Time to find out what Thunder is really guarding. Behind them, for the first time in 8 months, Hannah Cooper hummed a complete melody, something that sounded almost like hope wrapped in a child's trembling voice. And Thunder finally closed his eyes and rested, though the real fight was just beginning. The Cooper family's SUV smelled like McDonald's and expensive leather, an odd combination that somehow made them more human. Patricia sat in the back with Hannah, who clutched her drawing pad like armor against a world that had taught her silence was safer than words. Michael drove while Ben navigated from the passenger seat, the USB drive burning a hole in his jacket pocket like a piece of evidence that could either damn or redeem them all. They'd left Thunder at the shelter with Jessica's promise to call if anything changed, though Ben suspected nothing would. The dog had finally found a moment of peace with Hannah, and now they were asking him to trust again, to wait again, to believe that the humans fumbling with his fate actually knew what they were doing. There's a coffee shop on Magnolia, Michael suggested. Wi-Fi, quiet corners where we could— No. The word came out sharper than Ben intended, carrying weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying. My house. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Patricia leaned forward, her voice gentle with the practiced diplomacy of someone who'd navigated years of medical appointments and insurance denials. Dr. Marshall, we don't want to impose— It's Ben, he said, watching familiar streets roll past like frames in a movie he'd seen too many times. And it's not imposing. Margaret would have wanted— He didn't finish the sentence. Margaret would have wanted their house to be full of voices again, full of purpose beyond the daily ritual of talking to empty rooms and setting 2 coffee cups that would never both be used. 20 minutes later, Ben was unlocking his front door for the first time in months without apologizing to the silence. The Coopers followed him inside, Hannah still quiet, but watching everything with those ancient eyes that had seen too much for 7 years on Earth. She noticed Margaret's apron hanging on the kitchen hook, the 2 coffee mugs by the sink, the photographs covering every surface like a shrine to a life that used to make sense. "Beautiful home?" Patricia said softly, and Ben heard the careful kindness of someone who recognized grief's architecture, the way loss rearranged a space, making it both too empty and too full of memory. "Was," Ben corrected, powering up the ancient desktop computer in what used to be their guest room and was now just another museum exhibit in the Margaret Marshall Memorial House. The machine wheezed to life like an old dog being asked to fetch one more time, while Michael helped with connections and Patricia explored with her daughter. Through the doorway, Ben watched Hannah stop at the mantelpiece, studying a photograph of Ben and Margaret with their golden retriever, Rusty, taken 5 Christmases ago when the world still felt manageable. The dog in the photo had the same intelligent eyes as Thunder, the same alertness that spoke of deep understanding beyond simple animal instinct. "You had a dog," Hannah said, her second complete sentence in 8 months, delivered with the matter-of-fact observation skills that marked children who'd learned to read adults' faces for signs of danger or safety. "We did," Ben said, his throat tight. "Rusty. He died 6 months before Margaret. Heart failure just like hers would be. Sometimes I think he was trying to warn us, trying to prepare me for what was coming." The computer finally connected and Ben plugged in the USB drive with hands that shook from more than age. The drive contained 3 folders: Grace's voice, pictures for Thunder, and if someone finds this. He clicked on the last one first, needing answers before sentiment. A single document dated 8 months ago filled the screen. "My name is Grace Elizabeth Walker. I am 6 years old, but Mommy says I'm smart, like I'm 16. If you are reading this, something bad happened to me. Please take care of Thunder. He is the best dog in the whole world, and he protected me when Daddy got angry. Daddy says I'm going to heaven soon because of my brain sickness. That's okay, because Mommy is there, and she's been waiting for me for a long time. But Thunder can't come to heaven yet. He has to protect someone else now. That's his job. Here are the rules for Thunder. 1. He likes his ears rubbed when Thunder comes. That's why I named him Thunder. 2. He won't eat unless you say, 'Good boy, Thunder,' first, because that's how I taught him. 3. He's scared of belts, but he won't bite because I taught him biting is wrong. 4. Purple is his favorite color because it was mine. 5. He knows when you're sad and will bring you his toy mouse. 6. Don't let Daddy find him. Love, Grace. Elizabeth Walker. P.S. I hid money in the suitcase lining for his food. Thunder is expensive to feed because he's big, but he's worth it." The room went dead silent. Even the house seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of a 6-year-old's final testament. Patricia had moved to read over Ben's shoulder, her hand pressed to her mouth. Hannah stood in the doorway, watching them read about another little girl who'd loved a dog enough to plan for his future. "Jesus," Michael whispered, then caught himself. "Sorry, Don't apologize," Ben said. "Some things deserve stronger language than polite conversation." He clicked on the pictures folder next. The screen filled with images that told a story in reverse. Grace and Thunder in better days. A beautiful child with dark curls and eyes like sunlight, a German shepherd still whole and proud, birthday parties where Thunder wore a party hat while Grace giggled, Christmas morning with both of them surrounded by wrapping paper and joy. Then the pictures changed. Grace in a hospital bed, pale and thin, Thunder pressed against her side like a living blanket. Grace, with a shaved head, surgical scars visible like roadmaps of a journey no child should have to take. Thunder standing guard beside machines that beeped and hummed with electronic determination to keep small hearts beating. The last photo was dated just 2 weeks before Grace died. She could barely lift her head, but she was smiling, the kind of smile that happened when you knew time was running out and wanted to make every moment count. Someone, not her, had written on the bottom, "My best friend forever." "The recordings," Patricia said quietly. "We need to hear them." Ben almost said no. They'd already violated something sacred, already trespassed on the private grief of a child who'd faced death with more grace than most adults managed in a lifetime. But Richard Walker was coming tomorrow with ownership papers, and Thunder was sitting in a shelter cage believing he'd been abandoned again. They needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The first recording was innocent enough. Grace teaching Thunder to dance, both of them spinning in circles in what looked like a nice backyard. Her laugh was pure music, the kind of sound that made you believe in goodness, despite all evidence to the contrary. The second showed Thunder pulling Grace in a wagon, careful and slow, his movements calibrated to her fragility. Even then, he'd understood that his girl was breakable, that his job was protection measured in gentleness rather than aggression. The third recording made Ben's blood turn to ice. The camera was hidden, probably propped somewhere with careful 6-year-old planning. The angle showed a kitchen, Richard Walker visible from chest down. Grace's voice came from off-screen, small and frightened. "Daddy, please don't." The sound of impact, Grace crying. Then Thunder launching himself between them, not biting but blocking, taking the hits meant for her. Walker's voice slurred with alcohol and twisted with rage. "Get that damn dog out of my way!" More impacts. Thunder yelping but not moving, not retreating, just absorbing punishment meant for a sick child who weighed 40 pounds and was dying by degrees. Ben stopped the video. He couldn't watch more, couldn't process the calculated cruelty of a man who would beat a dog for protecting his dying daughter. But there were dozens more files, dates spanning months. A catalog of why Grace had needed protection, why Thunder bore those scars, why a 6-year-old girl had spent her final weeks planning for her dog's survival. "That son of a bitch," Michael said, his hands clenched into fists that wanted to find Richard Walker's face. "Language," Hannah said quietly, then added, "But yes, he's a bad man." They all turned to stare at her. She'd spoken again, clear as day, like she'd never stopped talking. She moved into the room, pointed at the screen where Grace's photo still glowed. "She's in heaven now, like my first mommy. Thunder told me." Patricia knelt beside her daughter, voice gentle with the wonder of hearing words she'd thought might never come again. "How do you know that, sweetheart?" "Thunder told me," Hannah repeated like it was obvious. "Not with words, but I understand. He's waiting to make sure she's okay. That's why he won't leave the suitcase. It smells like her love." The Alachua County Courthouse at 9:30 in the morning buzzed with the nervous energy of people whose lives hung in the balance of legal decisions. Emergency hearings happened in a smaller room where fluorescent lights hummed like angry wasps, and Judge Patricia Hayes presided with the steel-gray efficiency of someone who'd seen every variation of human cruelty disguised as legal righteousness. Ben Marshall sat behind the petitioner's table, his arthritic fingers clutching a manila folder containing printouts of Grace's files, feeling every one of his 72 years settle into his bones like lead. Across the aisle, Richard Walker slouched in his chair, reeking of bourbon at 10 in the morning, his lawyer, a sharp-dressed young man named Brennan, already shuffling papers with the aggressive confidence of someone billing by the hour. The Cooper family occupied the gallery like quiet sentinels. Hannah sat between her parents, clutching her drawing pad, the same three-note melody humming softly under her breath. In the past 18 hours, she'd spoken more words than in the previous 8 months combined, all of them in defense of a dog she'd known for less than a day. "Your Honor," Brennan began, his voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than truth. "This is straightforward. My client owns a valuable German shepherd, stolen from his property. The dog viciously attacked him when he tried to reclaim it. California law." "We're in Florida, Counselor," Judge Hayes interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "And I'll determine what's straightforward. Mr. Walker, present your ownership documentation." Walker's evidence was thorough and damning. Registration papers, veterinary records dating back to Thunder's puppyhood, even photographs of Walker with a younger, healthier Thunder. Every document legitimate, every piece of paper another nail in the dog's legal coffin. Ben watched his last hope crumble as each piece of evidence landed on the judge's desk. Thunder might be sitting in a kennel right now, refusing to eat, slowly dying from the belief that he'd been abandoned again, but legally he belonged to the man who'd wrapped duct tape around his eyes and left him to die on a highway. "Now," Judge Hayes said, adjusting her reading glasses, "tell me about this alleged attack." Jessica Martinez testified clearly, professionally, describing Walker's intoxicated arrival at the shelter, his aggressive behavior toward the Cooper child, Thunder's defensive response. The dog bit once, defensively, and immediately released when Mr. Walker let go of the child. "In 30 years of animal rescue, I've never seen more restrained, protective behavior." "So the dog is aggressive," Brennan concluded with the satisfied air of someone who'd just proven his point. "My client was merely trying to reclaim his stolen property when this vicious animal—" "The dog is protective," Ben interrupted, standing despite his knee's protests. "There's a difference." Judge Hayes looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Marshall, you're representing yourself. Do you have evidence of this difference?" This was it. The moment that would either save Thunder or condemn him. Ben approached the bench, feeling the weight of every mistake he'd ever made, every life he'd failed to save, every second chance he'd been too afraid to take. "Your Honor, I have video evidence spanning several months showing systematic abuse of both the dog and Mr. Walker's daughter, Grace. The same Grace who died on my operating table 3 years ago, the same case that cost me my medical license when Walker sued me for malpractice." Walker shot to his feet, face flushed with more than alcohol. "You can't use those. They're private property, stolen from my home." "From a suitcase," Ben corrected, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Abandoned on Interstate 24 with a dog whose eyes were duct-taped shut." The courtroom went dead silent. Even Brennan looked surprised, his prepared arguments suddenly useless against the weight of this revelation. "Sit down, Mr. Walker," Judge Hayes ordered. "Mr. Marshall, explain how you came to possess this evidence." Ben told the story, finding Thunder, the suitcase, Grace's letter hidden inside, the USB drive wrapped in plastic like a message in a bottle from a drowning child. Each word felt like presenting symptoms to a colleague. "Here's the disease, here's the damage, here's what we're fighting to save." "Play the videos," Judge Hayes said quietly. The first video filled the courtroom with Grace's laughter, her and Thunder dancing in a sunlit backyard, both of them spinning with the pure joy that existed before sickness and cruelty poisoned their world. Even Brennan watched with something approaching humanity on his face. But as the videos progressed, as Grace's health deteriorated and Walker's behavior worsened, the atmosphere in the room grew thick with horror. The recording of Thunder taking hits, meant for Grace, made Jessica gasp audibly. Patricia Cooper covered Hannah's eyes, though the child had seen worse in her young life. Walker sat stone-faced throughout, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. But Ben could see the calculation behind the man's eyes. the cold mathematics of someone deciding whether to continue the charade or cut his losses. "Enough," Judge Hayes said after the fourth video. Her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd spent decades witnessing humanity's capacity for cruelty disguised as righteousness. "Mr. Walker, would you care to explain these recordings?" "Stress," Walker said immediately, the word coming out too fast, too rehearsed. "My daughter was dying. I was grieving, drinking too much sometimes, but I loved that dog. Spent $5,000 training him to protect Grace." "To protect her from you," Ben said quietly. "Objection," Brennan snapped. "Mr. Marshall isn't a licensed attorney." "Mr. Marshall is a witness," Judge Hayes corrected. "And more than that, Mr. Marshall, tell the court your medical opinion of Grace Walker's condition." Here it was, the moment Ben had dreaded since recognizing Walker's name. The intersection of his greatest failure and his last chance at redemption. Grace Walker had a glioblastoma, an aggressive brain tumor, inoperable by the time we discovered it. The surgery was a last resort, attempted only because the family insisted. During the procedure, she suffered a catastrophic hemorrhage from an undetected aneurysm. "I couldn't save her." Walker's face twisted with 3 years of accumulated rage. "You killed her! You murdered my baby girl!" "An aneurysm killed her," Ben said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights and 10,000 moments of self-doubt. One that didn't show on any pre-operative imaging. "Your lawsuit claimed malpractice, but you know the truth. You've always known the truth." Judge Hayes removed her glasses, studying both men with the careful attention of someone weighing souls on scales that never quite balanced. "Mr. Marshall, in your medical opinion, was there anything you could have done differently?" "No," Ben said, the word coming out stronger than he'd expected. "I followed every protocol. I made every decision I would make again." Grace Walker died because sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite all our skill and dedication, children die, and sometimes the only thing left to do is honor their memory by protecting what they loved most. Walker lunged across the aisle, hands reaching for Ben's throat. "You took everything from me!" The bailiff caught him before he could make contact, but his words hung in the air like poison gas. "My daughter, my house, my life. You took it all." "You took those things yourself," Judge Hayes said coldly. "When you chose rage over grief, revenge over healing, cruelty over love." Judge Hayes studied the evidence spread across her bench like pieces of a puzzle that told a story no one wanted to complete. The videos had stopped playing, but Grace's voice still seemed to echo in the courtroom. A 6-year-old's laughter that had been silenced by disease and a father's rage that had outlived his daughter's memory. "Mr. Walker," the judge said finally, her voice carrying the measured weight of 30 years on the bench, "the evidence suggests a pattern of abuse toward both your daughter and this animal. However, legal ownership is clear, and Florida statute requires, Your Honor." Hannah Cooper's voice cut through the legal formalities like a silver bell ringing in a cathedral. She stood up in the gallery, her small frame trembling but her voice steady. "May I say something?" Brennan objected immediately. "Your Honor, the child has no standing in this case." "The child," Judge Hayes interrupted, "was the victim of Mr. Walker's assault at the animal shelter." "She has every right to speak." She looked down at Hannah with the gentle authority reserved for children who'd been forced to grow up too fast. "What would you like to tell the court, sweetheart?" Hannah walked to the center of the courtroom, her drawing pad clutched against her chest like armor. Patricia reached for her, but Michael held her back, sensing that their daughter needed to face this moment on her own terms. "I didn't talk for 8 months, Hannah began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Not since my first mommy died in a car accident. The doctors said I had selective mutism from trauma. But when I saw Thunder yesterday, I knew he understood. He understood not talking because sometimes words just make things worse. She opened her drawing pad, showing a picture she'd drawn the night before. Thunder and Grace playing in a field of purple flowers, both of them surrounded by golden light. "Grace talked to me in my dreams last night," Hannah continued, and Ben felt his chest tighten at the matter-of-fact way she delivered this impossible statement. "She said Thunder's job isn't done yet. She said he needs to help other kids like me, kids who are scared and can't find their words. She said if Mr. Walker takes him away, Thunder will die from sadness, and then he can't help anyone." Walker's lawyer leaned forward. "Your Honor, this is clearly fantasy from a troubled child." "Let her finish," Judge Hayes said sharply. Hannah reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this in the suitcase lining yesterday, underneath where the USB was hidden. Grace hid it there on purpose." She handed the paper to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Judge Hayes unfolded it, read it, and her face went pale. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice barely controlled, "did you write this?" She held up the paper, and Ben could see Grace's childish handwriting alongside something darker, angrier, Walker's handwriting in jagged letters. "When this is over, I'm putting that damn dog down. Can't stand looking at it. Reminds me of her. Should have done it months ago." "When did you write this, Mr. Walker?" Judge Hayes demanded. Walker said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Brennan whispered frantically in his client's ear, but Walker pushed him away with the aggressive dismissal of someone who'd already lost everything and no longer cared about consequences. "You planned this," Ben said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "The whole lawsuit, the malpractice claim, it was never about Grace. It was about making someone else pay for your guilt." Walker's face crumpled, not with remorse, but with the rage of someone whose carefully constructed narrative had finally collapsed. "That dog was supposed to die with her. Everything was supposed to die with her. But it kept living, kept looking at me with those damn eyes, kept reminding me that she's gone, and I—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. The courtroom had heard the confession wrapped in his fury, that Grace's death had been just the beginning of his plan to destroy everything she'd loved. Judge Hayes looked at the evidence one more time, then at Hannah, who still stood in the center of the courtroom like a small pillar of courage in a world that had tried to break her voice. "Mr. Walker," the judge said, "based on the evidence of systematic abuse, your written threat to kill this animal, and your clear intention to use legal proceedings as an instrument of revenge rather than justice, I'm ordering Thunder removed from your custody immediately." Relief flooded the courtroom, but it was short-lived. "However," Judge Hayes continued, "the bite incident requires a 10-day quarantine period under Florida statute. During this time, Thunder must be held in isolation at an approved facility. No exceptions." Ben's heart sank. 10 more days of Thunder believing he'd been abandoned. 10 more days of the dog slowly dying from the belief that love was temporary and humans were just another source of pain. "The animal will be held at Gainesville Veterinary Hospital under Dr. Chen's supervision," the judge concluded. "Custody will be transferred to—" She looked between Ben and the Coopers. "Joint custody," Patricia said quickly. "We'll share responsibility." Walker stood up, swaying slightly, his face twisted with 3 years of accumulated hatred. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. Judge Hayes banged her gavel. "Yes, Mr. Walker." "It is." But as they filed out of the courtroom, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won a battle only to lose the war. Thunder was safe from Walker, but 10 days in isolation might kill what remained of his spirit. 10 days was a lifetime to a dog who'd already been abandoned once and was only just learning to trust again. 3 days into Thunder's quarantine, Ben Marshall received the call that changed everything. He was sitting in his kitchen, staring at 2 coffee cups and wondering how victory could taste so much like defeat, when his phone rang with the sharp urgency that meant someone's world was about to shift on its axis. "Ben, you need to get down here. Now!" Dr. Sarah Chen's voice carried the tight control of someone trying not to panic. "Bring the Coopers. And Ben, bring that suitcase." The drive to Gainesville Veterinary Hospital took 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Hannah sat in the back seat, humming her 3-note melody with increasing anxiety, while Patricia and Michael exchanged the kind of worried glances that parents perfected after years of medical emergencies and sleepless nights. They found Dr. Chen in her office looking like she hadn't slept since the quarantine began. Her usually immaculate scrubs were wrinkled, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that spoke of hands too busy to care about appearance. "Thunder's shutting down," she said without preamble. "Complete refusal of food and water for 48 hours. He's not responding to stimuli, barely lifting his head. It's not just depression, it's systematic shutdown. Dogs can die from this." Ben felt his chest tighten with the familiar squeeze that meant his heart was reminding him of its weakness. "Can we see him?" "That's not the only problem," Dr. Chen continued, her hands moving restlessly through papers on her desk. "Richard Walker posted bail this morning. He's been calling every hour, demanding updates on Thunder's condition. His lawyer filed an emergency appeal claiming we're torturing his property by keeping them separated." The word property hit the room like a slap. Hannah stopped humming, her face going pale with the particular terror that belonged to children who'd learned that adults could be monsters wearing familiar faces. "He can't have Thunder back," she said, her voice small but fierce. "Grace said he would hurt him." Dr. Chen pulled out an evidence bag containing the purple collar they'd found in Grace's suitcase. "There's more. I x-rayed this on a hunch, something Grace wrote in her letter about hiding things for Thunder. There's a micro recorder sewn into the padding, probably voice-activated. The device is old, battery probably dead, but we might be able to recover data." Ben's hands trembled as he took the collar, feeling the weight of a 6-year-old's final plans, the desperate measures of a dying child trying to protect what she loved most. "How long to extract the data?" "Already working on it," Dr. Chen said. "But Ben, even if we find something, Walker's lawyer is good. He's arguing that Thunder belongs with his legal owner, regardless of past treatment. The court might have to—" A soft alarm chimed through the hospital's speaker system, followed by a voice. "Code Blue, Isolation Ward 3. Code Blue, Isolation Ward 3. They ran through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and hope deferred, Ben's hip screaming with each step, but his legs carrying him forward anyway. Thunder's isolation kennel sat at the end of a long hallway, surrounded by veterinary technicians and equipment that beeped with electronic urgency. Thunder lay motionless on his side, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his ribs. The suitcase sat in the corner of the kennel, untouched for days, the first time he'd been separated from it since Ben found him on the highway. "He's not responding," one of the techs reported. "Heart rate dropping, dehydration severe. It's like he's just giving up." Hannah pushed past the adults, pressing her face against the kennel bars. "Thunder! Thunder, can you hear me?" No response. The dog who'd found the strength to protect her, to trust her, to remember what love felt like, was disappearing before their eyes. "We need those recordings," Patricia said urgently. "Whatever Grace hid in that collar, it might be the only thing that can save him." Dr. Chen nodded, already moving toward her equipment. "Give me 20 minutes." But they didn't have 20 minutes. Thunder's breathing was becoming more labored, his body temperature dropping as his systems began the slow process of shutdown that marked the end of hope. Ben had seen it before in patients who'd simply decided that fighting was too hard, that letting go was easier than holding on. "Hannah," Ben said quietly, "talk to him. Keep talking." Sometimes hearing a familiar voice can— He's not giving up, Hannah interrupted, her voice carrying a certainty that made the adults stop their frantic preparations and listen. He's waiting. Waiting for what, sweetheart? Patricia asked. Hannah pulled out her drawing pad, showing them a new picture. Thunder and Grace standing together in a field of stars, with a golden thread connecting them to a small girl and an old man. He's waiting for Grace to tell him it's okay to love someone new. She's been trying to tell him, but he can't hear her over all the sadness. She started humming again, that same three-note melody, but this time she added words in a voice so pure it made Ben's throat close up. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Margaret's favorite hymn. The song that had played at her funeral, the melody that had comforted Ben through the darkest nights of his grief. How could this child know the exact song that had once meant hope to a dying woman and the husband who loved her? Thunder's ear twitched, just once, but it was movement, the first sign of life they'd seen in hours. Hannah kept singing, her voice growing stronger with each verse, and slowly, impossibly, Thunder's head lifted. His amber eyes found her through the bars, and for the first time in days, he focused on something other than his own despair. "That's it," Dr. Chen whispered, returning with the micro-recorder in her hands. "The data's corrupted, but I recovered fragments. Hannah, keep singing. Whatever you're doing, it's working." She played the broken recording, and Grace's voice filled the room, fractured and static-filled, but unmistakably the child who'd loved Thunder enough to plan for his future. Be good. Find someone. Love them like love you. Purple collar means safe. Trust the little girl. Trust the old man with sad eyes, Mommy says. Good dogs go to heaven, but not time yet. Help, Hannah. Help, Doctor. Ben, they need you. The recording cut out, but Thunder was sitting up now, his eyes moving between Hannah and Ben with something that looked almost like recognition, like understanding that love didn't end with death. It just found new forms, new purposes, new hearts to heal. That's when the alarm started blaring throughout the hospital, and Dr. Chen's face went white as she looked at her phone. "Walker's here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's brought police and a court order. They're demanding immediate access to Thunder." Through the hospital windows, Ben could see flashing lights in the parking lot, could hear the heavy footsteps of law enforcement officers who'd been convinced that they were here to enforce justice rather than enable cruelty. "How long do we have?" Michael asked. "Minutes," Dr. Chen replied. "Maybe less." Hannah looked at Thunder, who was now standing, pressing against the kennel bars as if sensing the approaching danger. Then she looked at Ben with eyes that held far too much wisdom for a 7-year-old. "Grace says it's time for the last secret," she said quietly. "The one she hid in the very bottom of the suitcase, underneath everything else. She says you have to find it now, before the bad man comes." Ben moved to the suitcase with hands that shook from more than age. He'd searched it thoroughly, found Grace's letter and toys and drawings. But Hannah was right. There was something else, something hidden beneath the fabric lining that he'd missed in his earlier desperation. His fingers found the edge of what felt like a sealed envelope, taped to the bottom of the case with the careful precision of a child who understood that some secrets were too important to trust to chance. The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer, and Walker's voice could be heard arguing with hospital staff, demanding his property, threatening lawsuits and arrests. Time was running out, and whatever Grace had hidden might be their last hope of keeping Thunder from the man who'd already destroyed so much. Ben tore open the envelope just as the first police officer appeared at the end of the hallway, Walker's attorney beside him, both of them moving with the inexorable purpose of people who believed the law was on their side. Inside the envelope was something that would change everything. Again, the envelope contained a single sheet of paper that made Ben's hands stop shaking and his heart stop beating for what felt like an eternity. It was a birth certificate, Grace Elizabeth Walker's birth certificate. But the father's name wasn't Richard Walker. It was David Michael Torres, and beneath that, in Grace's careful 6-year-old handwriting, "My real daddy died before I was born. Rick hurt Mommy and made her lie about it. Thunder knows the truth." "Jesus Christ," Ben whispered, then immediately apologized to the heir, though Margaret wasn't there to hear his language anymore. This changed everything. If Walker wasn't Grace's biological father, then his legal claim to Thunder, based on being Grace's guardian and heir, was fraudulent. The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer, Walker's voice rising with each step as he demanded access to what he still believed was his property. Dr. Chen was making frantic phone calls, trying to reach Judge Hayes, while Patricia held Hannah close and Michael positioned himself between his family and the approaching confrontation. Thunder stood at the kennel bars, no longer the broken creature who'd been shutting down just minutes before. Grace's voice on the recording, combined with Hannah's singing, had awakened something in him. Not just hope, but purpose. His amber eyes tracked the sounds of approaching danger with the alertness of a soldier who'd found his mission again. "Ben," Hannah said urgently, tugging at his sleeve. "There's more. In the envelope. Grace says you have to look deeper." Ben's arthritis-gnarled fingers found another document, folded smaller and tucked behind the birth certificate. It was a DNA test result, dated just 2 months before Grace's death, with a note paper-clipped to the top in an adult woman's handwriting. Grace insisted we do this test. She said she needed proof for Thunder's future. I don't understand what she meant, but I promised her I'd hide this with her other important papers. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, Children's Hospital. The DNA results were conclusive. Richard Walker was not Grace's biological father. The child he'd claimed to love, the child whose death he'd used as a weapon against Ben, the child whose memory he'd twisted into justification for cruelty, she had never been his daughter at all. "Dr. Chen," Ben called, his voice carrying across the isolation ward with more authority than he'd felt in 3 years. "We need to call Judge Hayes immediately. Walker has no legal standing to claim Thunder. He never did." But even as Dr. Chen dialed frantically, the hospital doors burst open and Walker strode in, flanked by 2 police officers and his attorney, Brennan. Walker's face was flushed with alcohol and vindication, his eyes carrying the cold satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to reclaim what was rightfully his. "Where's my dog?" Walker demanded, his voice echoing through the sterile corridors. "I have a court order. You people have been illegally detaining my property for 3 days." "Your property?" Ben stepped forward, the DNA results clutched in his trembling hands. "Grace wasn't your daughter, Walker. She never was." Walker's face went from flushed to pale in seconds. "That's impossible. I raised her from birth. I loved her." "You abused her," Hannah said, her young voice cutting through Walker's protests like a blade through tissue paper. "Grace told me in my dreams. She said you hurt her mommy too, hurt her so bad that she had to lie about who Grace's real daddy was." Brennan pushed forward, his lawyer's instincts kicking in even as his case crumbled around him. "These are obviously fabricated documents. My client has raised that child for 6 years, provided for her, cared for her." "Provided for her?" Patricia Cooper's voice rose with the righteous anger of a mother who'd spent too many nights wondering if she was failing her own child. "We've seen the videos, heard the recordings. Walker was beating that little girl while she was dying of cancer." The police officers exchanged glances, suddenly less certain about their role in this confrontation. The older one, a sergeant with graying temples, stepped forward. "Sir, If there's evidence that challenges your legal standing, there's no evidence, Walker shouted, but his voice carried the desperation of someone watching his carefully constructed lies unravel. That child was mine. I fed her, clothed her, took her to medical appointments. You sued the doctor who tried to save her life, Ben said quietly. You used her death as a weapon to destroy anyone who reminded you of your guilt. Grace knew, didn't she? She knew you weren't her real father, and she knew you killed her mother. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of thunder whimpering, not in pain, but in recognition. He'd been in that house, had witnessed whatever truth Grace had discovered about her parentage and Walker's role in her mother's death. This is ridiculous, Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even if Mr. Walker isn't the biological father, he was the legal guardian. He has rights. Rights based on fraud, Dr. Chen interrupted, snapping her phone shut. Judge Hayes is on her way. And gentlemen, she addressed the police officers, I've just been informed that the FBI is very interested in speaking with Mr. Walker about some irregularities in his insurance claims and the circumstances surrounding Grace's mother's death. Walker's face went through a spectrum of colors, pale to red to gray, as the weight of his situation finally penetrated the alcohol-fueled bravado that had carried him this far. You can't prove anything. Grace's mother died in an accident. I was at work. Thunder was there, Hannah said with the simple certainty of a child who'd never learned to doubt her intuition. Dogs remember everything. Thunder remembers what really happened. As if responding to his name, Thunder moved to the front of his kennel and did something that made everyone in the room freeze. He began to bark, not the aggressive barking of an angry dog, but the specific repetitive pattern that search and rescue dogs use to alert their handlers to discovered evidence. That's an alert bark, Dr. Chen said slowly, her eyes widening with understanding. Grace trained him to do that. She trained him to signal when he detected something important. Thunder kept barking, his eyes fixed on Walker with an intensity that made the man take an involuntary step backward. The dog's memory was perfect, his training complete, and his testimony, in the only language he had, was clear. This man was dangerous. Walker's attorney was already backing toward the door, his professional instincts finally overriding his retainer fee. Richard, I think we should leave. This situation has become complicated. But Walker wasn't listening. He was staring at Thunder with the hatred of someone whose carefully maintained facade had finally cracked, revealing the rot underneath. That dog should have died with her. Everything should have died with her. She wasn't supposed to leave me with nothing. She left you with nothing because you had nothing to begin with, Ben said, understanding finally flooding through him like sunrise after the longest night of his life. Grace was never yours. Her love was never yours. You were just a man who hurt the people she cared about, and she spent her last days making sure you couldn't hurt anyone else. Judge Hayes arrived at that moment, flanked by FBI agents whose presence turned the hospital corridor into a crime scene. She took one look at the DNA results, listened to a brief explanation from Dr. Chen, and made the kind of decision that restored Ben's faith in justice. Mr. Walker, she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd spent 30 years seeing through lies, you're under arrest for fraud, perjury, and suspicion of murder in the death of Maria Torres. As for Thunder, she looked at the dog who had stopped barking and was now sitting calmly, his job complete. Custody is hereby transferred to the Cooper family with Dr. Marshall as co-guardian. Walker's arrest was swift and final, his protests lost in the reading of Miranda rights and the click of handcuffs. As they led him away, he turned back one last time, his face twisted with 3 years of misdirected rage. "This isn't over," he called. But his voice carried no threat now, just the empty echo of a man who'd finally run out of people to blame for his own failures. Thunder was released from quarantine that afternoon, walking out of the veterinary hospital on legs that no longer trembled with fear or uncertainty. Grace's suitcase had been returned to him, but he no longer guarded it with desperate intensity. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a dog who'd completed his mission and found his new purpose. Hannah took his leash with hands that barely shook, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "Come on, Thunder. Let's go home." The word home seemed to settle over all of them like a blessing. Not the broken homes they'd left behind, Ben's empty house with its ghost of Margaret, the Coopers' worried silence, but something new, something built from the pieces of their shared damage and held together by the kind of love that a 6-year-old girl had understood better than any of the adults trying to honor her memory. As they walked toward the parking lot, Thunder paused and looked back once at the hospital where he'd nearly given up hope. Then he turned toward his future, toward the family that Grace had chosen for him across the veil of death, and took the first steps toward whatever healing looked like when broken things decided to be whole together. 6 months later, Ben Marshall stood in the Cooper family's backyard, watching Hannah and Thunder play fetch among the fallen autumn leaves, their laughter and barks mixing like a symphony of second chances. The guest house behind him had become more than shelter. It had become home in ways his old house never could be again. Not because it was newer or prettier, but because it was full of the kind of noise that makes silence feel like music instead of emptiness. Sunday dinner had become their sacred ritual. The dining table that once accommodated Ben's solitary meals now required extra chairs, place settings for 5 humans, and 1 German shepherd who insisted on his own placemat, courtesy of Hannah's unwavering belief that family meant everyone ate together. Grace's suitcase sat in the corner of the living room now, decorated with Hannah's stickers and drawings, transformed from a monument to loss into a treasure chest of memories that connected past love to present joy. "Ben, dinner?" Patricia called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the comfortable authority of someone who'd learned that taking care of others was how you healed your own heart. She'd found her purpose in nurturing this unlikely family they'd cobbled together from broken pieces, and in return, watching Hannah thrive had given her the confidence she'd lost during years of fertility struggles and whispered fears that she wasn't enough. Thunder bounded over to Ben, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd remembered what happiness felt like. The scars were still there, the torn ear, the marks on his ribs. But they'd become part of his story, rather than the end of it. He wore Grace's purple collar now, not as a burden, but as a badge of honor, proof that love could outlive the person who gave it and find new ways to grow. As they gathered around the table, Michael said grace while Hannah held Ben's hand on one side and Patricia's on the other. Thunder lay between their chairs, his massive head resting on Ben's foot, occasionally sighing with the contentment of a creature who'd finally found his place in the world. In his pocket, Ben carried a photo, not of Margaret, though he still treasured those, but of Hannah and Thunder at the park last weekend, both of them grinning at the camera with identical expressions of pure joy. "I have news," Ben announced as they passed dishes laden with Patricia's famous pot roast and Hannah's carefully arranged vegetables. The family tradition had emerged naturally, each of them contributing something to their weekly feast. Michael's homemade bread, Patricia's main courses, Hannah's artistic vegetable arrangements, and Ben's stories that connected their present to the history that had brought them together. Everyone paused, even Thunder perking up at the change in conversational tone. After 6 months together, they'd learned to read each other's rhythms, to sense when ordinary moments were about to become extraordinary. "The medical board made their final decision," Ben continued, watching their faces for the reaction he hoped to see. "They've offered to reinstate my license with the provision that I work only in consultation, reviewing complex pediatric cases, mentoring young surgeons, providing second opinions on difficult diagnoses." Hannah launched herself from her chair, nearly knocking over her glass of milk in her enthusiasm. "You're going to help kids again?" she exclaimed, wrapping her arms around Ben's neck with the fierce affection of a child who'd learned that some adults were worth trusting completely. "Going to try," Ben corrected, but he was smiling for the first time in years, not the polite, social smile he'd perfected for grocery store clerks and bank tellers, but the real thing, the expression that came from somewhere deeper than politeness or obligation. At 72, his hands weren't steady enough for surgery anymore. His eyes required stronger glasses, and his heart reminded him daily of its limitations. But his mind was sharp, his experience valuable, and most importantly, he'd learned to see past the obvious symptoms to the human story underneath each case. He could spot the next Grace Walker before it was too late, recognize the signs that others might miss, advocate for children who needed someone to speak for them when their own voices weren't enough. "That's wonderful," Patricia said, and Ben heard the genuine joy in her voice. Over the months, she'd become the sister he'd never had, the family member who remembered his medication schedule and made sure he ate vegetables and worried about him in the way that made loneliness impossible. "When do you start?" "Next month," Ben replied. 2 days a week at Children's Hospital. They want me to review complicated cases, maybe catch what others might miss." He paused, looking around the table at these people who'd become his family through shared trauma and chosen love. "Like I caught Thunder." Thunder's tail thumped against the floor at the mention of his name, and Hannah giggled, a sound that never failed to remind Ben that miracles came in ordinary packages, delivered by children who'd found their voices and dogs who'd learned to trust again. After dinner, as Patricia and Michael cleaned up with the comfortable efficiency of a long-married couple, Ben and Hannah took Thunder for his evening walk. She chattered constantly now, making up for 8 months of silence with an endless stream of observations, questions, and stories that connected everything in her world to everything else. Thunder trotted between them, no longer scanning for threats, no longer flinching at sudden movements, just enjoying the simple pleasure of walking with his people on a cool Florida evening. "Ben?" Hannah asked as they turned toward home, the porch lights of their house glowing warm against the gathering dusk. "Do you think Grace knows that Thunder is happy now?" It was the kind of question that had no scientific answer, the type of inquiry that would have made Ben uncomfortable in his old life when he believed that medicine could explain everything, and death was simply the failure of biological systems. But 6 months of living with a child who spoke to angels and a dog who carried messages from beyond had taught him that some truths were bigger than what could be measured or proven. "I think Grace is the reason Thunder found his way to us," Ben said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. "I think she knew exactly what she was doing when she trained him to wait for the right people, when she hid those recordings and documents, when she planned for his future, even while she was dying. Grace loved Thunder enough to make sure he'd find another little girl who needed him." Hannah nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the matter-of-fact wisdom of someone who'd never learned to doubt that love could transcend physical boundaries. "And Thunder helped you too," she added. "Grace probably knew you needed saving just as much as I did." The simple truth of her statement hit Ben like a physical blow, not painful, but powerful, the kind of realization that rearranges everything you thought you knew about yourself. For 3 years, he'd believed he was the failed surgeon who couldn't save Grace Walker, the man whose mistakes had cost a child her life. But maybe he'd been something else all along. Maybe he'd been the person Grace knew would one day find her dog and understand that saving Thunder was how he'd save himself. That night, after everyone was asleep, Ben sat in his small living room in the guest house writing a letter he'd never send to a child who'd never read it. It had become his ritual, these conversations with Grace, these progress reports on the dog she'd loved enough to plan for his survival. "Dear Grace," he wrote, "Thunder saved another child today. Hannah had a seizure at school, her first one in months, and Thunder alerted the teacher before anyone else even noticed the signs. The doctors say his early warning probably prevented serious injury. You trained him well, little one. You gave him everything he needed to keep protecting people, even after you couldn't be there to do it yourself." Outside his window, he could see the main house where the Coopers were settling in for the night, could hear the faint sound of Hannah's laughter as she said goodnight to Thunder in her room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. His first day back at the hospital in 3 years, new cases to review, young doctors to mentor, children to help heal. But tonight, everything was perfect in the way that only imperfect things could be when they decided to love each other anyway. Ben sealed the letter and placed it with the others in his desk drawer. Love letters to a child who'd taught him that some promises were too important to break and some love was too strong to die. Thunder padded into the room, did his nightly security check, then came to Ben and laid his great head on the old man's knee. "Good boy," Ben whispered, rubbing the ears that Grace had loved, feeling the trust that had grown between them like something planted in good soil and tended with patience. "Good, brave boy." Thunder's tail wagged once, a message received and understood. Outside, the Florida night hummed with the sound of insects and possibility, and inside, 3 generations of chosen family slept peacefully under the same sky, protected by a dog who'd learned that love doesn't end with goodbye. It just finds new ways to say hello. To all of you reading this who understand what it means to start over after loss, who've wondered if your best chapters are behind you, who've stared at empty chairs and quiet rooms, this story is for you. At 72, Ben thought his purpose died with his wife and career. But sometimes God works through 4-pawed angels carrying suitcases full of second chances. Family doesn't always arrive the way we expect. Sometimes it comes through broken hearts that decide to heal together, through children who teach us about courage, through dogs who show us that loyalty outlives everything else. Your story isn't over. The love you've given doesn't disappear. It waits for new hearts to nurture, new purposes to fulfill. Whether you're 55 or 68 or anywhere in between, remember that being needed is the greatest gift you can give yourself. Have you ever found unexpected family after loss? What moment showed you that your story wasn't over but just beginning a new chapter? Share your story below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.